Stallone came to talk about his charity, but Colbert tried to trap him on live TV. The questions got personal, the mood turned tense. So Sylvester Stallone stood up, took off his mic, and walked out. Welcome to Stalone Unleashed. Let's uncover what really happened. The green room hummed with a low, anxious energy, a stark contrast to the boisterous bonhomie Elias Thorne had just witnessed on the monitors displaying the live broadcast. He sat on a plush, oversized sofa that seemed to swallow him, a worn leather satchel resting at his feet, its contents a private inventory of a life lived far from such manufactured merriment. He wasn't a man of talk shows, of witty banter, and carefully curated anecdotes. His world was one of quiet craftsmanship, of which shavings and the slow, patient revealing of form from unyielding material. He was here, an anomaly among the glittering personalities and their attendant entourages, because a persistent producer had seen a short documentary about his life's work, restoring antique carousels, bringing forgotten wooden animals back to vibrant life, and had, for reasons Elias still found baffling, deemed him interesting television. He clutched a small, smooth piece of hand-carved cherrywood in his pocket, a miniature horse, its lines worn smooth by years of unconscious touch. It was a piece of his past, a reminder of a promise to a younger sister who had adored the magic of carousels, a sister long gone, but never forgotten. The show's host, a man named Alistair Finch, was a whirlwind of charm and sharp, often barbed wit. Elias had watched him on the monitors, effortlessly guiding conversations, eliciting laughter, occasionally skewering a guest with a well-aimed barb disguised as a jest. Finch was a master of his domain, the polished stage his kingdom. Elias felt a familiar sense of unease, the discomfort of a quiet man, thrust into a loud, performative world. His segment was next. A young, harried assistant with a clipboard and an overly bright smile had just given him the 5-minute warning. Her words a rapid-fire burst of instructions about cameras, cues, and keeping the energy up. Elias had merely nodded, his expression unreadable. He wasn't here to perform. He was here, he supposed, to speak his truth, however unsuited it might be to the relentless demands of prime-time entertainment. He thought of the carousel animals he painstakingly restored, each one carrying the silent stories of generations of children, of fleeting moments of joy and wonder. Those stories, he felt, had more substance, more enduring value than much of what passed for conversation on shows like this. The door to the green room opened, and Alistair Finch himself swept in, a radiant smile plastered on his face, though his eyes, Elias noted, were sharp, assessing, already calculating the angles for the upcoming segment. Elias, my man, ready to wow America with your whittling. Finch boomed, his voice a little too loud for the small room, his bonhomie a little too forced. He clapped Elias on the shoulder, a gesture of feigned camaraderie that made Elias flinch inwardly. It's carving, actually, Elias corrected quietly, his voice a low rumble that seemed to absorb some of Finch's manufactured energy. And it's more about listening to the wood than imposing my will on it. Finch blinked, his smile faltering for a fraction of a second. This wasn't the folksy, easily digestible soundbite he had perhaps been expecting. Right. Listening to the wood. Deep. I like it. He winked at a nearby producer, a silent signal that this guest might require a little more management. Well, let's go listen to some applause, shall we? Finch said, steering Elias towards the door. As they walked through the labyrinthine corridors backstage, the roar of the studio audience growing louder, Elias felt the small wooden horse in his pocket, its familiar contours a grounding presence in the swirling artifice. He wasn't sure what Finch, or America, expected of him, but he knew he could only be himself, a quiet man with a story to tell, a story carved not just in wood, but in the grain of a life lived with integrity and a deep, abiding respect for the things that endure. The clash, he sensed, was not just between two different personalities, but between two different worlds, two different ways of valuing what truly mattered. The transition from the dim backstage corridors to the blinding glare of the studio lights was abrupt, disorienting. The roar of the audience, a wave of undifferentiated sound, washed over Elias as Alistair Finch. His smile now, at full wattage, guided him to a plush armchair opposite his own imposing desk. The set was a marvel of modern design, sleek lines and vibrant colors, all calculated to convey an image of sophisticated, accessible entertainment. Elias sat, his posture a little too upright for the chair's deep cushions, his hands resting calmly in his lap. He felt the eyes of the audience, 1,000 unseen points of focus, and the cold, unblinking gaze of the multiple cameras. It was a profoundly unnatural environment for a man accustomed to the solitude of his workshop, the quiet companionship of wood and tools. Finch launched into a glib, pre-rehearsed introduction, filled with folksy superlatives about Elias's charming, old-world craft and his dedication to keeping alive the forgotten magic of yesteryear. Elias listened, his expression unchanging. He recognized the attempt to frame him, to package him into an easily digestible, slightly quaint persona. "So, Elias," Finch began, leaning forward with his trademark conspiratorial grin, "tell us, what's it like to spend your days talking to tiny wooden horses? Do they ever talk back?" The audience tittered, a well-trained response to Finch's gentle mockery. Elias met Finch's gaze, his own eyes steady, unamused. "They don't talk back, Mr. Finch," he said, his voice quiet but carrying a surprising resonance in the hushed studio. "But they do speak. They speak of joy, of innocence, of a time when wonder was a little easier to find." Finch raised an eyebrow, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. This wasn't the self-deprecating, ah-shucks response he might have anticipated. "Deep stuff, Elias. Deep stuff for Tuesday night." He turned to the audience, a mock-serious expression on his face. "Are we ready for some deep, wooden horse philosophy, folks?" More laughter, a little louder this time. Elias didn't react to the provocation. He simply waited, his stillness a counterpoint to Finch's restless energy. "You restore old carousels, is that right?" Finch continued, consulting his notes with a flourish. "Bringing these relics back to life. Must be a dusty, thankless job, eh? All those splinters." "There is dust, yes," Elias conceded, "and occasional splinters. But there is also beauty and history. Each animal I restore has a story. It has felt the touch of countless hands, witnessed generations of laughter, of dreams." He paused, his gaze drifting for a moment as if seeing those spectral riders. To bring that back, to allow those stories to continue, that is not a thankless task. It is a privilege. Finch leaned back, a small, almost imperceptible frown creasing his brow. Elias was not playing the game, not following the expected script. He wasn't folksy. He wasn't easily flustered. He was serious. And seriousness, Finch knew, could be a dangerous thing on a show built on levity and fleeting amusement. "A privilege, huh?" Finch mused, tapping his pen against his desk. "Most people would probably prefer a privilege that comes with, say, a decent dental plan, or maybe shares in a tech startup." The audience chuckled, but there was an edge to Finch's humor now, a hint of aggression. He was trying to regain control, to put Elias back in the box he had prepared for him. Elias felt the small wooden horse in his pocket. He thought of his sister, her face alight with joy as she rode the brightly painted stallion on the town green carousel, so many years ago. That memory, that pure, unadulterated joy, was more valuable than any tech startup, any dental plan. "Some privileges, Mr. Finch," Elias said, his voice still quiet but firm, "cannot be measured in dollars and cents. Some values are timeless." The word timeless hung in the air, a quiet rebuke to the show's relentless pursuit of the new, the trendy, the disposable. Finch's smile tightened. The battle of wills, unspoken but palpable, had begun. Alistair Finch, sensing he was losing the upper hand, decided to shift tactics, moving from gentle mockery to a more direct, almost confrontational line of questioning. He clearly intended to provoke a reaction, to create a moment of television drama that would resonate with his audience, even if it meant unsettling his guest. "So, Elias," Finch said, his voice taking on a sharper, more prosecutorial edge. This privilege you speak of, this dedication to old, forgotten things, isn't a bit escapist? A retreat from the real world, from progress? Are you saying we should all just go back to riding wooden horses and ignore the complexities of modern life? The question was a loaded one, designed to paint Elias as a Luddite, a quaint anachronism out of touch with contemporary realities. The studio audience, sensing the shift in tone, grew quieter, their earlier amusement replaced by a more watchful, expectant attention. Elias met Finch's challenging gaze without flinching. "I'm not suggesting a retreat from the present, Mr. Finch," he replied calmly. "I'm suggesting that we should not so easily discard the past. The lessons, the beauty, the craftsmanship of what came before. These things have value. They inform who we are. They provide a sense of continuity, of connection, in a world that often feels fragmented and disposable. But isn't that just nostalgia?" Finch pressed, leaning forward, his eyes narrowed. "A sentimental attachment to a past that probably wasn't as rosy as you remember it? We live in an age of innovation, Elias, of constant change. Isn't clinging to these relics just a way of avoiding the future?" "There is a difference, Mr. Finch," Elias stated, his voice gaining a quiet intensity, "between sentimental nostalgia and a deep respect for enduring quality, for craftsmanship that was meant to last, not to be obsolete in a year or two." He gestured subtly, as if encompassing the sleek, modern set around them. "Much of what is new is designed for obsolescence. It is fleeting, but a well-carved piece of wood, a story well told, a piece of music that touches the soul. These things endure. They connect us across generations. They remind us of what it means to be human in any age." He reached into his pocket and slowly, deliberately, took out the small, hand-carved cherrywood horse. He placed it on the edge of Finch's polished desk, its warm, organic presence a striking contrast to the cool, artificial surfaces of the studio. "This," Elias said, his voice softening, "was carved for my sister. She loved carousels more than anything. She believed they were magic. She's gone now, many years. But this small horse, it holds her memory. It holds her joy. Is that merely nostalgia, Mr. Finch? Or is it something more profound?" The studio was utterly silent. Even Finch seemed momentarily taken aback, his usual glibness deserting him. The camera zoomed in on the small wooden horse, its simple, timeless beauty suddenly imbued with a powerful emotional resonance. Elias had not raised his voice, had not resorted to theatrics. He had simply spoken from the heart, sharing a piece of his own story, his own truth. And in doing so, he had subtly, yet profoundly, shifted the dynamic of the interview. He was no longer just a quaint craftsman. He was a man of deep feeling, of quiet conviction, a guardian of memories and values that transcended the fleeting concerns of a talk show. Finch cleared his throat, a small, almost imperceptible sign of his discomfort. He had expected an easy target, a folksy eccentric he could gently mock for the amusement of his audience. Instead, he found himself face to face with a man of quiet, unshakable integrity, a man whose simple words carried an unexpected weight. The carefully constructed artifice of the show seemed to tremble, just for a moment, in the face of such unadorned authenticity. Alistair Finch, a seasoned performer accustomed to controlling the narrative, quickly tried to recover. He couldn't allow his guest, especially one so unassuming, to seize the moral high ground. His smile returned, a little strained, a little too quick. "That's a very touching story, Elias," he said, his voice dripping with a practiced, slightly condescending sympathy. "And I'm sure your sister was a lovely girl. But we can't all live in the past, can we? We can't all be curators of sentimentality. The world moves on. Progress demands it. Isn't there a point where holding on to these old things, these old ways, just becomes, well, a bit sad, a bit irrelevant?" The barb was sharper this time, more personal. He was trying to provoke Elias, to paint him as a figure of pity, a man unable to cope with the modern world. The studio audience shifted uneasily. Some of Finch's regular fans chuckled, but many others looked uncomfortable, sensing the host's deliberate cruelty. Elias looked at the small wooden horse on Finch's desk. Then he looked directly at Finch, his eyes, usually so calm, now holding a flicker of cold, controlled anger. "Irrelevant, Mr. Finch," he said, his voice still quiet, but now edged with steel. "Is human connection irrelevant? Is beauty irrelevant? Is the memory of love irrelevant?" He leaned forward slightly, his presence suddenly more formidable. "You speak of progress. But what kind of progress is it that discards these things? What kind of future are we building if it has no room for the heart, for the soul, for the simple, enduring truths that connect us to our past and to each other?" Finch scoffed, a harsh, dismissive sound. "Oh, please, Elias. Don't get all high and mighty on me. This is an entertainment show, not a philosophy lecture. My audience wants to laugh, to be diverted. They don't want to be preached at by a glorified carpenter who thinks wooden toys are the answer to the world's problems." The insult was blatant, brutal. The audience gasped, a collective intake of breath. Even Finch seemed to realize he might have gone too far, a fleeting look of panic in his eyes before his arrogant mask snapped back into place. But Elias did not react with anger. Instead, a profound, almost sorrowful expression settled on his face. He looked at Finch, not as an adversary, but as a man profoundly, tragically out of touch with something essential. "A glorified carpenter," Elias repeated softly, almost to himself. He then looked out at the audience, his gaze sweeping across their faces. "Yes, I work with wood. I shape it. I listen to it. And in doing so, I try to bring a little beauty, a little joy into the world. If that is irrelevant, Mr. Finch, then I pity you. I pity a world that has become so enamored of the fleeting, the superficial, that it can no longer see the value in things that are made with love, with care, with a respect for the enduring spirit of craftsmanship." He stood up then, a slow, deliberate movement. He reached for the small wooden horse on Finch's desk, his hand enclosing it gently. "I believe my time here is done," he said, his voice calm, dignified. "I came to speak about my work, about the joy of creation, about the importance of preserving a little magic in a world that often seems to have forgotten it. But it appears this is not the place for such a conversation." He turned, not to Finch, but to the audience. "Thank you for listening," he said simply. And then, with a quiet dignity that was more powerful than any shouted word, he began to walk off the stage. The studio was in stunned silence. Finch sat frozen at his desk, his mouth slightly agape, his usual glib retorts failing him. The cameras followed Elias as he walked, his back straight, his head held high. He had not looked back. He had said his piece. He had spoken his truth. And in doing so, he had exposed the hollowness at the heart of Alistair Finch's glittering, superficial kingdom. The silence in the studio was absolute, a shocked, uncomprehending void where moments before there had been laughter and applause. Alistair Finch remained frozen at his desk, his face a mask of disbelief, his carefully constructed persona shattered. The cameras, momentarily confused, stayed on Elias Thorne's retreating figure until he disappeared through the backstage exit. Then, chaos erupted. Producers and stage managers rushed onto the set, their headsets crackling with urgent, panicked voices. Finch, jolted out of his stupor, began to shout, his voice shrill, demanding to know what had just happened, who was responsible for this unprofessional debacle. The audience, sensing the raw, unscripted drama, began to murmur, then to buzz, their earlier amusement replaced by a mixture of shock, embarrassment, and for some, a dawning, reluctant admiration for the quiet man who had dared to walk away. Backstage, Elias moved with the same unhurried calm he had displayed on stage. The harried assistant who had earlier briefed him now stared at him with wide, incredulous eyes, her clipboard forgotten in her hand. Other crew members, who had witnessed the exchange on the monitors, looked at him with a mixture of awe and trepidation. No one had ever walked off Alistair Finch's show before. It was unthinkable. Elias found his way back to the green room, his satchel still resting on the sofa where he had left it. He picked it up, his movements deliberate, unhurried. He could hear the muffled sounds of Finch's continued shouting from the direction of the studio, the frantic attempts of the production team to regain control, to salvage the show. He felt no triumph, no satisfaction in Finch's public unraveling. Only a quiet sorrow, a sense of a profound disconnect between the values he held dear and the values that seemed to drive so much of the world around him. He had not come to cause a scene, to create a scandal. He had simply refused to be disrespected, to allow his work, his passion, his very essence, to be trivialized and mocked for the sake of cheap entertainment. The small wooden horse was still clutched in his hand. He looked at it, its smooth, familiar lines of comfort. It represented something true, something enduring, something Finch, in his relentless pursuit of ratings and fleeting fame, had clearly lost sight of. A senior producer, a woman with a stern, authoritative air, intercepted him as he was about to leave the green room. "Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice tight with suppressed anger, "you can't just walk off a live television show. This is a breach of contract. This is unprofessional." Elias met her gaze calmly. "Was Mr. Finch's behavior professional, madam?" he asked quietly. "Was it professional to insult a guest, to mock his life's work, to dismiss his deepest values as irrelevant sentimentality?" The producer opened her mouth to speak, then closed it again. She had no answer to that. Elias nodded. "I believe I have fulfilled my obligation. I presented myself. I answered his questions to the best of my ability until he made it clear that he had no interest in a genuine conversation, only in ridicule." He turned to leave. "If you wish to discuss contracts," he added, pausing at the door, "I suggest you first discuss with Mr. Finch the terms of basic human decency. He seems to have forgotten them." And with that, he walked out, leaving the producer speechless, the distant roar of Alistair Finch's indignation echoing in the corridors behind him. He had entered the studio a quiet, unassuming craftsman. He left it a man who had, in his own way, spoken a profound truth to a world that desperately needed to hear it. Elias navigated the labyrinthine backstage corridors, the frantic energy of the studio personnel a stark contrast to his own inner calm. He found the exit that led to the service alley, a gritty, unglamorous space far removed from the polished facade of the television studio. The cool night air was a welcome relief after the stuffy, superheated atmosphere of the broadcast. He took a deep breath, the scent of city grime and distant rain strangely comforting, real. He was alone now. The sounds of the studio, Finch's receding anger, the panic chatter of the crew, fading behind him. He felt a profound sense of weariness, not physical, but emotional. The confrontation, though quiet on his part, had taken its toll. It was never easy to stand against the tide, to defend one's principles in the face of ridicule and dismissal. He walked slowly down the alley, his footsteps echoing in the stillness. He wasn't sure what the repercussions of his actions would be. He hadn't thought that far ahead. He had simply acted out of a deep, instinctual need to preserve his own integrity, to honor the values that gave his life meaning. The small wooden horse was still in his hand. He looked at it, its simple, honest form a stark contrast to the artificiality he had just escaped. He thought of his sister, her bright, innocent belief in magic and wonder. He had tried, in his own way, to keep a little of that magic alive in his work and his life. Alistair Finch, with his cynicism and his relentless pursuit of the superficial, represented everything that sought to extinguish that magic. A battered service door at the end of the alley opened, and a young woman, one of the junior production assistants he had seen backstage, hurried out. She looked flustered, uncertain. "Mr. Thorne," she called out, her voice hesitant. Elias paused, turning to face her. "Yes. I just wanted to say," she began, then stopped, seeming to struggle for words. "What you did walking off like that, it was something." She looked around, as if afraid of being overheard. "No one ever stands up to Mr. Finch. He can be very difficult. Some things are more important than accommodating difficulty," Elias said quietly. The young woman nodded, a new respect in her eyes. A lot of the crew, we were impressed. You said what a lot of us have wanted to say for a long time. She offered him a small, tentative smile. Thank you. Elias was taken aback. He had expected condemnation, or at least indifference. This quiet expression of support from someone within the belly of the beast was unexpected and strangely moving. There is still good in the world, he said, more to himself than to her, a faint smile touching his own lips. You just have to look for it. And sometimes you have to fight for it. The young woman nodded again. Then, with a quick, almost shy glance, she hurried back inside. Elias watched her go, a small flicker of hope igniting within him. Perhaps his actions, however small, however personal, had resonated with others. Perhaps the quiet truth he had spoken had found fertile ground, even in the unlikeliest of places. He continued his walk, the weight in his satchel, the wooden horse in his hand, no longer feeling like burdens, but like anchors, grounding him in a world that, for all its flaws, still held the possibility of beauty, of integrity, of quiet, enduring magic. The clash with Alistair Finch had been fiery, yes, but it had also, perhaps, illuminated something important, something that had been lost in the glare of the studio lights. The city streets were slick with a light drizzle that had begun to fall, reflecting the neon signs and traffic lights in shimmering, distorted patterns. Elias walked without a specific destination, the rhythm of his steps a counterpoint to the turmoil of the evening. He found himself near a small, quiet park, one of the city's forgotten green spaces, and sat on a damp bench beneath the sheltering branches of an old oak tree. The roar of the city was muted here, replaced by the gentle patter of rain on leaves, the distant sigh of traffic. He took the small wooden horse from his pocket and placed it on the bench beside him. In the dim, ambient light, its simple form seemed to possess a quiet dignity, a timeless resilience. He thought about Alistair Finch, about the world of fleeting fame and manufactured outrage he inhabited. It was a world so far removed from his own, a world whose values seemed alien, almost incomprehensible. Yet, for a brief, uncomfortable hour, their worlds had collided, and the impact he sensed would linger. He wondered if Finch would learn anything from the encounter, if the public humiliation of a guest walking off his show would prompt any self-reflection. Probably not, he mused. Men like Finch were often too insulated by their own success, too surrounded by sycophants, to recognize their own failings. But perhaps some in the audience, some of the crew, like the young woman in the alley, had been touched, had been reminded that there were other ways to live, other values to uphold. That, he thought, would be a small victory in itself. He wasn't angry anymore. The earlier indignation had faded, replaced by a profound, almost melancholic understanding. The world was what it was. There would always be those who valued spectacle over substance, ridicule over respect. His role, he felt, was not to change them, an impossible task, but to remain true to himself, to his own craft, to the quiet whispers of the wood that spoke to him of beauty, of endurance, of the enduring magic of a well-told story. The rain began to fall more steadily, a soft, persistent rhythm. Elias didn't move. He sat there on the damp bench, the small wooden horse beside him, a solitary figure in the deepening night. He felt a strange sense of peace, the kind that comes after a storm, after a battle fought with integrity, if not with triumph in the conventional sense. He had not wowed America, as Finch had so glibly predicted. He had not played their game. He had simply been himself. And in a world that constantly demanded conformity, that often punished authenticity, perhaps that was the most radical act of all. He picked up the wooden horse, its smooth, familiar contours a comfort in his palm. He had carved it for his sister, a tribute to her belief in magic. And tonight, in a strange, unexpected way, he felt he had honored that belief, had defended it against the cynicism and superficiality of a world that had largely forgotten it. He stood up, pulling the collar of his worn jacket tighter against the rain. It was time to go home, back to his workshop, back to the quiet companionship of his tools and his wood, back to the slow, patient work of bringing beauty and wonder into a world that so desperately needed it. The fiery clash with Alistair Finch was over. But the quiet song of the carousel horse, the enduring magic it represented, would play on. As Elias made his way home through the rain-swept streets, his thoughts were not of anger or vindication, but of a quiet, settled purpose. The encounter on the talk show, as jarring and unpleasant as it had been, had served to clarify something within him, to reaffirm the values that had always guided his life. He had been thrust into a world that was not his own, a world of artifice and fleeting attention, and he had refused to compromise his integrity, his belief in the enduring power of craftsmanship, of memory, of love. The image of Alistair Finch's stunned, disbelieving face as he walked off stage was not a source of triumph, but a somber reminder of the chasm that existed between their respective worlds. Finch, for all his fame and fortune, seemed impoverished in a way Elias, with his simple life and his dedication to his craft, was not. Finch was a prisoner of his own image, of the relentless demand for novelty and sensation, while Elias was free to pursue a life of quiet meaning, of creating beauty that was meant to last. He arrived at his small, unassuming house, the rain still falling steadily. The porch light cast a warm, welcoming glow. Inside, his workshop awaited, filled with the familiar scent of wood shavings and varnish, the silent promise of works yet to be created. He took the small wooden horse from his pocket and placed it on his workbench, beside a half-finished carousel lion whose fierce, noble face was slowly emerging from a block of raw oak. The two figures, one small and worn with love, the other large and full of nascent power, seemed to converse in the quiet language of wood, of artistry, of enduring spirit. Elias knew that the story of his appearance on Alistair Finch's show would likely become a minor anecdote, a fleeting moment of internet chatter, quickly forgotten in the relentless churn of the news cycle. There might be articles, opinions, perhaps even some condemnation of his unprofessional behavior. None of it mattered to him. What mattered was that he had remained true to himself, true to the memory of his sister, true to the quiet dignity of his craft. He had spoken for the forgotten magic, for the enduring value of things made with love and care, in a world increasingly dominated by the disposable and the superficial. That, he felt, was a stand worth taking, regardless of the consequences. He ran a hand over the smooth, cool wood of the unfinished lion, feeling the life, the story, waiting to be released. This was his world, his purpose. Here, amidst the tools and the sawdust, he was not a glorified carpenter, but an artist, a storyteller, a keeper of dreams. The fiery clash on live television was over, but the quiet, patient work of creation, of infusing wood with spirit, with memory, with magic, would continue. And in that enduring work, Elias Thorne found his truest, most profound relevance. The carousel would turn, the wooden animals would dance, and the echoes of his sister's laughter would live on, a testament to a love and a magic that time could not diminish, and no cynical talk show host could ever truly understand. The following morning, Elias awoke to a world that felt subtly, yet significantly, altered. The rain had stopped, leaving the air clean and crisp, the autumn sunlight sharp and clear. He went about his usual routine, coffee, a quiet walk, then to his workshop. But as he worked, shaping the noble head of the carousel lion, he found his thoughts returning to the events of the previous evening. He hadn't checked the news, had no interest in the inevitable media storm that might be brewing. His concern was not for public opinion, but for the private integrity he had fought to maintain. Around midday, there was a hesitant knock at his workshop door. It was the young production assistant from the studio, the one who had spoken to him in the alley. She looked nervous but determined. In her hand, she held a small, slightly crumpled envelope. "Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice a little breathless, I know this is unorthodox, but I felt you should see this. It's from some of the crew, and some viewers. They found out where your workshop was from that old documentary, I guess." She handed him the envelope. "No one asked me to bring it. I just I thought you should know that what you did, it meant something to people. Elias took the envelope, surprised. Thank you, he said, genuinely touched by her gesture. That's very kind of you. She gave him a quick, shy smile. You're a good man, Mr. Thorne, she said. Don't let anyone tell you different. And then, before he could respond, she turned and hurried away. Elias looked at the envelope in his hand. It was addressed simply to the Carousel Man. He opened it. Inside were several handwritten notes, some on scraps of paper, others on more formal stationery. They were from various people, sound technicians, camera operators, makeup artists from a show, and even a few viewers who had apparently tracked him down. The messages were varied, but they all shared a common theme: gratitude. Gratitude for his courage, for his quiet dignity, for his refusal to be bullied or belittled. Thank you for reminding us what real class looks like, one note read. Another said, you spoke for all of us who are tired of the noise and the nastiness. Keep carving your magic. A third, apparently from fellow woodworker, simply stated, respect, brother. You honor the craft. Elias read each note slowly, a lump forming in his throat. He had expected, perhaps, criticism, or at best, indifference. He had not expected this outpouring of quiet support, this affirmation from strangers who had recognized and valued the stand he had taken. He thought of Alistair Finch, isolated in his glittering tower of fame, surrounded by yes-men and the hollow echo of his own manufactured laughter. And he thought of these small, heartfelt messages, testaments to a shared humanity, a longing for authenticity, for decency. He carefully placed the notes on his workbench, beside the small wooden horse and the nearly completed lion. They were, in their own way, as precious as any masterpiece he had ever carved. They were a reminder that even in a world that often seemed to celebrate the superficial, there were still people who valued the genuine, the enduring, the true. The fiery clash had indeed forced him to leave the show. But in doing so, he had perhaps ignited a different kind of fire, a small, warm flame of hope and recognition in the hearts of others. And that, Elias Thorne realized, was a far greater wow than Alistair Finch could ever comprehend. The quiet support Elias received in the days following his abrupt departure from Alistair Finch's show was a balm to his spirit. It wasn't just the notes from the studio crew and viewers. It was the subtle nods of acknowledgement from neighbors, the slightly warmer greetings from the shopkeepers in his local village, the newfound respect in the eyes of acquaintances who had perhaps previously dismissed him as a quiet eccentric. It seemed his stand, broadcast live to a national audience, had resonated far beyond the confines of the television studio. He learned, through a discreet inquiry from the young production assistant who had become an unlikely ally, that Alistair Finch was facing considerable backlash. Social media was apparently abuzz with criticism of his unprofessional behavior, his bullying tactics, his dismissive attitude. Sponsors were reportedly uneasy. The network executives were concerned. Finch himself, according to rumor, was uncharacteristically subdued, his usual on-air arrogance tempered by a new, visible caution. Elias took no pleasure in Finch's discomfort. His intention had never been to destroy, only to defend. But he did feel a quiet satisfaction in the knowledge that actions have consequences, that even those who seem untouchable can be held accountable for their behavior, if only by the court of public opinion, or by the quiet, collective voice of conscience. He continued his work in his workshop, the rhythmic scrape of his tools a comforting counterpoint to the lingering echoes of the television studio. The Carousel Lion was nearing completion, its fierce, noble spirit emerging more clearly with each passing day. He worked with a renewed sense of purpose, a deeper understanding of the importance of his craft, not just as a means of self-expression, but as a way of preserving something precious, something magical, in a world that often seemed determined to crush it. One afternoon, a sleek black car pulled up outside his workshop. A man in a tailored suit emerged, carrying a briefcase. Elias recognized him immediately. It was the senior producer from the network, the woman who had confronted him backstage after he walked off the show. He braced himself, expecting a legal summons, a demand for a public apology, something to salvage the network's damaged reputation. The producer, however, looked different. The stern, authoritative air was still there, but it was softened by a hint of weariness, of grudging respect. "Mr. Thorne," she said, extending her hand. "May I come in?" Elias invited her into his workshop. The scent of wood and varnish a stark contrast to the sterile corridors of the television studio. She looked around, her eyes taking in the array of tools, the half-finished carvings, the tangible evidence of a life dedicated to craft and beauty. "Mr. Finch," she began, without preamble, "has issued a public apology for his behavior towards you on the show." Elias was surprised. "Has he?" "Yes," the producer confirmed. "It was less than heartfelt, in my opinion. More of a damage control exercise. But it was an apology nonetheless." The network insisted. She paused. "What you did, Mr. Thorne, it caused quite a stir. It made a lot of people, myself included, do some serious thinking about the kind of television we're making, about the values we're promoting." She looked directly at Elias. "We'd like to offer you another opportunity. Not on Mr. Finch's show, of course. But we have another program, a quieter, more thoughtful arts and culture segment. We'd like to feature your work, your story, properly this time, with respect, with dignity." Elias was silent for a long moment, considering her offer. He thought of the small wooden horse, of his sister, of the quiet magic he had always tried to protect. He thought of the notes of support, the unexpected affirmation from strangers. Perhaps, he mused, this was an opportunity not just to share his craft, but to share a message, a quiet counter-narrative to the noise and cynicism of the world. "On one condition," he said finally. "And what is that, Mr. Thorne?" the producer asked. "That the focus is not on me," Elias replied, "but on the work, on the stories the wood has to tell, on the enduring power of beauty, of memory, of the human spirit that seeks to create and to connect, even in the face of indifference or ridicule." The producer smiled, a genuine, unforced smile this time. "That, Mr. Thorne," she said, "is exactly what we had in mind." The fiery clash had indeed forced him to leave one show, but it had opened the door to another, a quieter, more authentic stage where his voice and the voice of his craft could truly be heard.